Welcome back. Thanks for staying with us as we continue with our rolling coverage of the aftermath of the passing of Queen Elizabeth II. Joining us now from London to share some reaction, and that of South African expatriates in the UK upon hearing of the monarch's demise. So South African journalist in the UK, Heather Walker. Very good evening to you. Thank you for your time. Perhaps let's start on what we heard from King Charles III. I mean, his inaugural address, speaking to some changes, speaking to the qualities in terms of leadership of Queen Elizabeth, as well as speaking about William, as well as Harry and Meghan, speaking to some new titles.
Yeah, so he obviously mentioned his wife Camilla, who would become Queen's consort. He spoke about Harry and his wife Catherine, or Kate, mentioning that they would take on his old titles, so the Prince of Wales, and then also wanted to express his love and support for Harry and Meghan in their life in the US. So he carried on a tradition in that sense of, his mother, the Queen, very, very devoted to her family and very keen to see them progress in their lives.
There's been a lot of mixed reaction on the Queen's passing here in South Africa. I can almost imagine what the reaction has been in the UK with South Africans. What have they been saying? Because a lot of talk here and a lot of sentiment has been making reference to colonialism and speaking about the anger around the huge diamond that the Queen never returned. What's the reaction on that end?
I think it hasn't been quite as vociferous, but there's definitely an element of that. Not everyone is lining up to pay tribute to her, but I do think there is a sense of respect in some ways, no matter whether you're a monarchist or you believe that she presided over some real cruelty during the colonial era. There is still a sense of respect for the life she led and the leadership that she had. So I think it's been slightly less angry than in South Africa, but obviously they are within the South African and other diaspora communities over here. Certainly there's been people saying, well, we can't just, put a gloss on the entire era and say it was all perfect, because there was definitely a lot of injustice. But I think the interesting thing that sort of Charles mentioned in his speech as well is that she started in a particular era and changes have happened quite a lot in the sort of 70 years she reigned. So we went from colonial, where Britain ruled so much of the world, dismantling of all those kind of nations, and now independence. And so I suppose you've seen a lot of changes for the good and the bad during her reign.
As you mentioned, King Charles, we also heard him during his inaugural address this evening, speaking to the Queen's 21st birthday in Cape Town, and also saying that it was at that time that she devoted her life to the service of the people. And, of course, speaking about her being here in South Africa in Cape Town.
Yeah, so that was a great addition to the speech, kind of just acknowledging, in a way, her devotion to Africa and to the Commonwealth itself, which was a huge part of her life. And how the Commonwealth will progress now is difficult to say, as I think one of your earlier commentators has said as well. King Charles has always been very devoted to the Commonwealth as well. So presumably that legacy will carry on. But it was good to hear how her entire sort of chapter of her life was kind of rooted in the trip that she took to South Africa back then.
Yeah, a lot of the conversation or the address this evening also spoke to a lot about the Commonwealth. I mean, we heard the King making reference to it several times, and also at the memorial service that was taking place at the cathedral in London, there was also mention of the Commonwealth nations, which of course has a history looking at South Africa and, even as far back as former President Nelson Mandela.
Yes, well, I mean, we believe that Nelson Mandela and Queen Elizabeth were actually on very good terms. They called each other by their first names, which is quite unusual when you speak to the Queen. And he visited London a couple of times. There was a famous, the famous moment where he rode through the streets in the carriage beside her, and everyone was cheering, and nobody really knew who was the most exciting celebrity. Was it Mandela? Was it Queen Elizabeth? Because they both had such support in London at the time. And so there has obviously been a very long and sometimes rough connection between the two countries, particularly during apartheid, but especially in post-apartheid years. I think the relations certainly warmed between the monarchy and the South African government.
And another perhaps element that may have come out in terms of some reassurance from King Charles this evening, speaking about the role of the monarchy, speaking about the consistency that remains, saying things like that he also is dedicating himself, pledging to uphold the constitutional principles, and also saying that the role and the duties of the monarchy will remain.
Yes, I think he's definitely trying to create a sense of legacy from his mother's era, and trying to sort of create a very smooth transition. It doesn't sound like he's going to create any big innovations. I think the sense is that they're trying to keep the royal family as much as it was like during the time his mother was on the throne. So I suppose that's quite telling. But the interesting thing, of course, earlier on was the fact that he actually got out of the car and he arrived at Buckingham Palace, and then he proceeded to go around and shake people's hands and accept their condolences and even kind of console them in turn, which was a very moving moment, because he was obviously trying to reflect the fact that he's not just going to be sitting behind it, in a palace. He is obviously wanting to kind of get out and meet the people and kind of be part of their lives. So that's quite a positive sign, I think.
As he also made mention of Harry and Meghan, he also, that speaks to some of the changes that will affect their children, prior to also the suggestions from Meghan that the son was denied the title because of his race. I mean, that in itself speaks to something else, him mentioning them and extending his love.
Yeah, I mean, I think King Charles has always been a very kind of dignified and graceful person, quite unlike, I think, his father, who tends to be quite blunt, Prince Philip. But Charles is he's always the type of person. He's quite magnanimous, and he will try and include others, no matter what's kind of gone on in the family. And I think, well, we hear that supposedly there's some kind of rift between William and Harry. Yeah. I'm not sure if there's any truth to that, but obviously I think their father is really trying to bring the family together at this very sad time for them. And then obviously extending kind of, hand of friendship towards Meghan. It's been a bit difficult, but now we hear supposedly that children will have the titles of prince and princess. Presumably that will come through as time goes on. But yes, there certainly has been allegations of racism, certainly in that very kind of bombshell interview that Harry and Meghan did with Oprah recently. But where the Queen stood on all of this is very difficult to say, I suppose.
Yeah. So what has the general feeling been around, a leadership or the future of the monarchy under King Charles? I mean, what have people been saying on the ground about that?
Well, I mean, I've heard for quite a few years now that there's been a sort of feeling among a lot of people that they like the Queen, even if they're not a monarchist, but then they kind of have this feeling that when she finally goes, they want to abolish the monarchy. Then there are, of course, others who are, very happy to see King Charles finally get to the throne after, retirement. He's now actually stepping into his real job, 73 years on. So I think there's people who feel like he deserves a chance to become king after all this time. But then there's also people who I think, despite their reservations about the monarchy, they do see the good in some ways that it brings to the country. So I think a lot of people will not admit it, but I think they secretly harbor quite a love for the royals and the role they play in British tradition and British society. they are a very British institution, and they are known worldwide. When you think of the Queen, you would have always thought of Queen Elizabeth, and no one else really.
Yeah. The mourning period will be quite extensive. Talk to us about that and what you've seen in terms of that and how people are reacting to it.
Yes, it's quite interesting to see. Obviously, a lot of things that have been planned for the next few days have been cancelled in respect for the family. So football games have been cancelled, a number of other events, and so people are trying to show respect. And then there's, of course, the Queen will be arriving back in London. Her body will lie in state for several days on view to the public for them to come and pay respects. Books of condolences opening up around the country in different venues where people can come and write messages both virtually and in person. Then, of course, after all of that has taken place, there will be the funeral service once again in Westminster Abbey, where the memorial is happening today. And so there will be a lot of ceremony, a lot of traditions that need to be carried out along the way in accordance with, of course, what monarchs centuries and centuries back have done. So it's very much in keeping with the traditions and the values of the royal family itself.
Very well. Thank you so much for bringing us some of that information. South African journalist in the UK, Heather Walker, speaking about the death of Queen Elizabeth II.